Civil War and certainly into the 20th century that made a difference between your staying well and healthy and able to live with your family or being punished or sent to jail or beaten.
Look down, that long, long farm road.
We think about the Jim Crow South as a nadir of African American life, and in many ways it seemed to be in terms of violence and economic disadvantage. But African Americans struggled mightily to make a new South for themselves. Wherever you look, you see black churches, black schools, black associational life, and it's part of a process to try to struggle within the South to have more control over their lives. They didn't get everything they wanted, but they made important strides along those lines.
A number of black leaders rose to prominence in this period to speak publicly for a population that had been largely silenced. Their responses to discrimination ranged from anger to accommodation.
I believe it is the duty of the Negro, as the greater part of the race is already doing, to deport himself modestly in regard to political claims.
Born a slave, author and educator Booker T. Washington saw blacks as an integral part of the economy of the New South. He urged Southern businessmen to hire blacks rather than immigrants for their industrial enterprises.
When he delivered his Atlanta address in 1895, he said, "We will be hardworking and frugal and obedient, and in return there would be the opportunity to prosper, slowly, modestly, but in time, robustly." And so economic prosperity would eventually, he promised, lead to the kind of civil rights that the imprudent and premature demands for them had precluded.
I think on a certain level what he was saying was really quite powerful and persuasive, because I think it spoke to a sort of ethic American possibility in terms of what you can do, what you can make of yourself. And so there's a complex response in terms of African Americans saying at one point, well, we certainly agree with him on the one hand, but then what he's arguing is anathema because it's only going to reinforce the prescribed sphere in which we're being squeezed into.
On the eve of Plessy versus Ferguson, Washington voiced no objection to segregation.
In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress.
Mr. Washington represents in Negro thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission. Is it possible and probable that 9 millions of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their exceptional men?
Among Washington's most vocal critics was the writer and intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois.
We want full manhood suffrage, and we want it now, henceforth and forever. We want discrimination in public accommodation to cease. We claim the right of free men to walk, talk, and be with them that wish to be with us. We want the laws enforced against white as well as black. We want our children educated.
W.E.B. Du Bois was a most unusual man, brilliant, exquisitely educated. He looms large because of a book he wrote in 1903, a book called The Souls of Black Folk, a collection of 16 essays. That became the charter for those African Americans who increasingly were suspicious of and indeed deeply offended by the solutions that Booker T. Washington had proffered. The sum of it was Du Bois's position that you cannot get your rights by brokering them away, that the logic of rights is that you don't give them up, and indeed you demand them, and you demand them not in the fullness of time, but as the rights of a citizen immediately.
How shall we get them? By voting where we may vote, by persistent, unceasing agitation, by hammering at the truth, by sacrifice and work.
One black leader who lived out Du Bois's creed of action and agitation was Ida B. Wells. Journalist, lecturer, and crusader, Wells fearlessly used her Memphis newspaper as a tool to confront the campaign of violence against blacks in the South.
She had 3 friends who were lynched. They were owners of the People's grocery store in Memphis. White people in that community did not want to share that economic opportunity with them. She was furious about that. She didn't have a lot of friends, for one thing, but she was also concerned quite righteously about what it meant to live in a nation where there were laws and where there was supposed to be justice and where people were not supposed to be victimized in the ways that she knew that these 3 men were victimized.
They were loaded on a switch engine of the railroad which ran back of the jail, carried a mile north of the city limits, and horribly shot to death. It is said that Tom Moss begged for his life for the sake of his wife and child and his unborn baby.
So she wrote an editorial about the real cause of that lynching and went on to make her case for what she thought the real story was.
This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was. An excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized and keep the nigger down.
She was a tiny woman, but she carried a great big stick. Getting the word out, getting the truth out, and then using her rhetorical abilities to be persuasive.
Wells continued her anti-lynching campaign for the rest of her life. She called on her black audiences to leverage their economic power to demand justice. If justice was not forthcoming, she urged them to migrate north and deprive the South of their labor. In the face of the ongoing threat of murder and dismemberment, Wells exhorted African Americans to meet fire with fire.
The more the Afro-American yields and cringes and begs, the more he has to do so. The more he is insulted, outraged, and lynched. A Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give.
Accommodation, agitation, direct action. African American leaders of the late 19th century advocated a wide range of responses to the conditions of life in the Jim Crow South. None of these strategies did much to improve the daily lives of blacks living in the South, but they were beginning to build the arguments and institutions that would grow and bear fruit in the coming century.